the Senate failed to extend 3 key provisions of the Patriot Act.
Collection of phone records, USA Freedom Act.
Collection of Americans' phone data.
These things will suffer tax.
Necessary.
A group of senators trying to take down the Patriot Act.
Snowden was a game changer.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media developments we're looking at this week. Washington puts mass surveillance under the microscope as lawmakers there struggle to deal with the fallout from the Edward Snowden files. Japan, where the media are proving to be no match for a prime minister who wants to push his story, Shinzo Abe. In Sudan, if the government doesn't like what the papers are saying, it just takes them off the newsstands. And some of YouTube's best-known characters are on board with this in-flight safety video. 2 years ago this coming week, Edward Snowden, a former U.S. National Security Agency contractor, made headlines and a bit of history when he revealed that intelligence agencies were systematically tracking Americans' phone calls, capturing their emails and their metadata through a series of surveillance tools. Mainstream news coverage painted Snowden as either a hero or a pariah. President Obama said he welcomed the debate pitting the need for national security versus the right to privacy. Yet his Secretary of State, John Kerry, still calls Edward Snowden a traitor and a coward. But this week, Congress may hand Snowden his biggest victory to date, because on June 1st, one of the most controversial sections of the US Patriot Act exposed by Snowden, the part that gives the NSA some of its powers, will expire. Congress is torn over renewing the law, and if it doesn't, there's another piece of legislation lying in wait. It's called the USA Freedom Act. It would reform the NSA and effectively end aspects of the surveillance program as we know it. But is this really Congress's decision to make? It turns out that there was a meeting held in the British countryside a couple of weeks ago involving a who's who of tech giants and former intelligence chiefs, a band of big brothers, discussing behind closed doors where surveillance is going. Our starting point this week is Washington, D.C., where the clock is ticking and Congress is undecided.
The core issue essentially is liberty versus security.
Whether the government should be able to get information about innocent people who have no connection to terrorism simply in the name of national security.
Where do questions of national security impinge on our rights in a democratic society?
But defense hawks have argued that the intelligence community would find it difficult to prevent another 9/11 if they didn't have these programs in place.
But regardless of how this current debate ends, there's still a lot of work to be done.
A sunset clause looms over Washington, a provision within the Patriot Act that expires on the 1st of June. Unless Congress agrees to renew Section 215 of the law, and as of yet the numbers, the votes, are just not there, the NSA stands to lose the legal pretext it requires to sweep up phone records and to do it in bulk.
As we do this interview, we're days away from the legal expiry of that particular section. History isn't yet written because the Senate has to sit down at the last minute and debate whether to allow the act to die and indeed whether to pass an act that would go further in curbing the surveillance.
And the program that's been debated and discussed most often is the call record program. And that's the program where the government has collected information about every call Americans make, who they call, how long they speak to them. And it's a program that's operated in virtual secrecy before Edward Snowden. And just earlier this month, a federal court found that that program actually violated provisions of the Patriot Act. It was illegally operated.
And there is a small faction of lawmakers who believe that that court ruling is an outlier, that these programs are being mischaracterized. But the fight is really between the defense hawks in Congress and the lawmakers who are a combination of progressives as well as libertarians, and who believe that this is a government overreach to be sweeping records in this sort of bulk form.
So the challenge for Congress is trying to pass a bill that will assuage some of the liberty concerns, while also maintaining a robust national security structure that allows it to deal with the threats posed by groups like ISIS, posed by cyber warfare. So there are some of the dynamics that are playing out.
The NSA's supporters in Congress are trying to get the Patriot Act's Section 215 renewed, while simultaneously trying to stop the passage of the USA Freedom Act. One of the Freedom Act's authors, Jim Sensenbrenner, was also instrumental in the creation of the Patriot Act in 2001. However, Sensenbrenner says that the NSA has misused those powers, gone far beyond the intent of the legislation, and that it's time to put the NSA's metadata program out of business. The way for Congress to do that, he argues, is to pass the USA Freedom Act.
And what that bill would do, it would end nationwide collection, and it would end the ability of the government to get large amounts of records of, say, an entire zip code or state. But what the act wouldn't do is stop the government from going to the phone companies and still requesting large amounts of information, much of which could be completely irrelevant and associated with people with no nexus to terrorism.
What is being argued over in the US at the moment would basically mean that the telephone records go out of the government's hands and into the hands of the telecom agencies themselves. I don't necessarily see this as being a big problem if the US government gets out of the telephone collection game and passes it over to the companies. Most in the intelligence community would be relatively relaxed about that, providing that the information could then be accessed in a reasonably quick manner.
Against the political backdrop of congressional deliberations, an extraordinary gathering was held across the Atlantic. Some reports called it a secret meeting. The organizers prefer to call it private. It happened 2 weeks ago at a country manor in Britain and brought tech giants such as Apple, Google, and Vodafone together with spy chiefs, current and former, from the US, Britain, Germany, France, Australia, and Canada, as well as a select few journalists to talk about the future of surveillance. What was said remains officially off the record, but one of the participants has shed some light on the proceedings.
The conference organizers asked me and the current boss of Britain's spy agency, GCHQ, to open the conference together and try and chart issues that people should discuss. Quite remarkable for the person who's running the spy agency. And in the light of Snowden, it was obviously, in their thinking, an appropriate thing to do publicly, to be seen to be joining the debate by putting their top official beside one of the loudest critics.
But to have the actual policy heads from Google and Apple convening with the intelligence community shows just how pressing this issue is, not just from the perspective of privacy, but also from a business perspective, because one of the arguments that Google and Apple and other companies have made is that they are losing overseas business because there are customers overseas who don't want their information, their records, to also be gathered by these companies, by the federal government over here.
Both sides are appealing to the public. Intelligence agencies are under pressure, so they are trying to justify their actions. And at the same time, large technology companies, if they face a revolt from their customers, they'll obviously tell the intelligence agencies to back off. If the intelligence agencies exert sufficient pressure on them, they'll cooperate with the intelligence agencies. They are primarily interested in profit, in their public image, and they will do whatever they deem to be most beneficial to that public image.
The other thing we've been told about that private tech summit is that no one, not even the spy masters, was interested in shooting the messenger. Unlike the politicians in D.C., the consensus, reportedly, was that it's time to move on and focus on the message.
This was such a meeting of minds, and nobody wanted to do the tired stuff like, is Edward Snowden a traitor? Even if they hated what Edward Snowden had done, they completely acknowledged that he had changed the world, and that was why we were meeting.
On the download this week, our viewers on the coverage of the surveillance story.
I don't see the kind of tough questions and accountability being asked of the NSA and of other high-ranking federal agencies. We could start by asking the questions to presumptive presidential candidates. Will you support amnesty for Edward Snowden if you're elected president.
It's not that surprising that America spies on other countries, and it's easy to make the case that's in Americans' best interests. So running to China and then cozying up to Russia so he could talk about global surveillance programs often conducted with the help of our allies made Snowden look like a defector. Whether or not he's a traitor, he definitely does not come across as a patriot, and that's going to continue to hurt his case in America.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week: the authorities in Sudan have confiscated editions of at least 9 newspapers and suspended the licenses of 4 others in what appears to be the latest assault on press freedom there. The National Intelligence and Security Service, the NISS, reportedly seized the print editions of the newspapers May 25th after a privately owned daily called Al Khartoum published an article on the sexual abuse of children on their school buses. Just 3 months ago, more than a dozen papers were seized by the NISS ahead of the election victory of President Omar al-Bashir. The Paris-based media rights group Reporters Without Borders says that 35 editions of various papers were seized during 2014. The organization suggests that the government knows that the financial impact of this could put the papers out of business. The trial of a Washington Post journalist who faces charges of espionage has begun behind closed doors in Iran. Jason Rezaian, the paper's Tehran bureau chief, has been held for 10 months after being accused of, quote, passing information to hostile governments and propaganda against the establishment, unquote. He faces up to 20 years behind bars, while his wife, Yaganeh Salehi, who's also a journalist, faces similar charges. Rezaian's family has criticized the authorities for conducting the trial in secret. His brother Ali said, having a closed trial, it just shows how scared the Iranians are to show that there is evidence. I think they're embarrassed by the evidence they have. They have gone along with this sham for the last 10 months. He is totally innocent. The Washington Post has said that the charges are unfounded. According to the paper's foreign editor, we believe there is no basis whatsoever for the charges against him. What Jason did was act as a journalist, which involves gathering information, verifying information, and ultimately publishing it. 2 reporters in Brazil have been found murdered within the space of a week. On May 23rd, Jama Santos de Canseco was found in the northeastern state of Bahia. His body showed signs of torture. Santos de Canseco hosted a daily show on a community radio station and regularly spoke out on corruption and local crime. Local news reports suggest that he'd been threatened for his journalism before. His murder follows that of Avani Jose Metzger, a blogger who wrote about drug trafficking and child abuse, who was decapitated in the southeastern state of Minas Gerais less than a week before. Sarah Rofsky of the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists said the brutal murders of 2 Brazilian journalists in less than a week represents a troubling escalation of anti-press violence in Brazil, already one of the most dangerous countries in the world to be a journalist. The last time we reported on Japan, we told you about a new secrecy law designed to keep a lid on whistleblowers and discourage reporters from pursuing government secrets. Well, since then, in December, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and his Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, won convincingly in a snap election. So why would he need to worry about coverage in the mainstream news media now? Well, the Prime Minister's economic policies, known as Abenomics, cannot be called a runaway success, and his plans to restart the country's nuclear industry remain overshadowed by the Fukushima disaster. Then there's Abe's determination to play a role in the fight against ISIL, which amounts to a departure from Japan's pacifist constitution. Many in the Japanese news media are compliant and deferential, with a system of press self-regulation as institutionalized as the Keisha clubs or press clubs, mediating between journalists and the government. It's not easy to get ahead as a reporter if you rock the boat. So when a critic of Abe's policies on the Middle East went live on the air and declared that I am not Abe, that proved to be a bad career move. The Listening Post's Will Young now on journalism in Japan and Shinzo Abe's Medianomics.
In January, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe pledged $200 million in non-military aid to the countries fighting ISIL in the Middle East. Within 48 hours, ISIL demanded an identical sum for the release of 2 Japanese hostages. One of them, Kenji Goto, was a journalist. Ever since World War II, Japan's policy of pacifism has been constitutionally enshrined. One of the few media voices to argue Abe's Middle East policy might be unconstitutional was Shigeaki Koga, a commentator on a program called Hodo Station, which airs on one of the country's biggest channels, Asahi TV.
テレビ朝日では作っていただくのは非常に申し訳ないと思ったら自分で作ってきました。I am not Abe というのをですね。1月23日にですね。
On January 23rd, I said, I am not Abe. It wasn't just a question of the hostage crisis. I was concerned that the wrong image was being spread about us Japanese, the notion that we wanted to take part in the fight.
だけどそれは日本人の気持ちじゃないですよと。
This isn't how the Japanese people think. They are of a different point of view to Abe. I knew that I was going to be fired. I wanted to say this was not a normal reshuffle, so I explained this live on air, to highlight how much pressure the government has exerted onto the media.
今日が最後ということでですね、菅官房長官はじめですね、官邸の皆さんにはものすごいバッシングを受けてきましたけれども、マスコミはもう
The media, who have been paralyzed by Abe's administration, said that those who appeared on TV should not be provoking the situation any further.
みんな言ったんですよ。
So there are reports that Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga said, if it was up to me, I would declare that Koga's comments were in violation of the broadcasting law. That sent a warning shot across the bows of TV Asahi, meaning the displeasure of Prime Minister Abe, meaning that TV Asahi might face a lot of pressure.
At the end of the day, he and the anchor celebrity presenter had a very much open row in the public on the show. So I frankly don't know. It had to do with any sort of perceived pressure.
ちょっと待ってください。ちょっと待ってください。小川さん、待ってください。今のお話は私としては承服できません。
I think Mr. Koga's allegations have gathered a certain number of followers, but successfully alienated himself from otherwise very much friendly supporters of his.
Alienated or excommunicated. What the Cabinet Secretary said concerning Koga's outburst left little room for interpretation. We will closely watch how the TV station handles the issue in line with the broadcast law, Suga told reporters. A day later, Asahi TV's chairman apologized to viewers for what he called an unscheduled happening. The chairman denied any government pressure, but ministries have on several occasions sent letters to the producers of Hodo Station. And in November last year, a letter was sent to all major networks in advance of December's elections. The language was low-key, but in the Japanese context, the message was clear.
もちろん言葉は丁寧なんですよ。
The letter is of course very polite, with phrases such as, I'm consistently grateful for your help, but it also uses words such as fairly, neutrally and composed, and advises on how to choose commentators and conduct interviews. For the government to write to broadcasters, especially before elections, exerting pressure, is rather frightening, especially as they hold the ministerial authority to grant permits and approvals.
Although every broadcaster and media outlet received these guidelines, there was no reporting on the issue until I said something about it. For journalists from other countries, this would not even have been considered a serious level of pressure, but simply an objection from the government. The Japanese media panic on a daily basis and then feel the need to apologize.
Consider one measure of a healthy media. Country rankings by Paris-based NGO Reporters Without Borders, based on those countries' records on press freedom. Japan improved dramatically after 2006, rising to 11th place in 2010. Shinzo Abe led the LDP back to power in 2012, and Japan has dropped 50 places in the index to 61st. Some point to a series of national upheavals, among them the nuclear disaster at Fukushima. Others to a state secrecy law that criminalizes whistleblowing and the journalism that would bring government leaks to light.
It's a stunning nosedive. You know, it's dramatic failure from the 11th to the 61st.
After the Fukushima 3 nuclear reactor meltdown, the press here seemed to be overly deferential, and the government under Abe has passed state secrecy legislation. This criminalizes whistleblowing, so any journalist caught trying to solicit secrets is subject to long-term imprisonment.
Even without such a threat, Japanese journalists have, in the main, been reluctant to embarrass their political leaders. Self-censorship is a problem in many countries, but in Japan it goes one step further, into the realm of collective self-censorship. Whether it's the Tokyo Police, Toyota Motor Company, or a government ministry, access to information requires high-level sources, and only journalists who are members of Kisha Club or press clubs get a foot in the door.
To attend press conferences at the Finance Ministry, you must be a member of the Finance Ministry's Kisha Club. It is absolutely essential that you are a member of the Kisha Club in order to gain any information. So no one dares step outside the circle. Rather, they're in consultation, and thus the articles all end up being the same.
It's not the government that controls who's a member. The media are in control. Their target is consistency. This is the typical Japanese mentality, that it's safer to be in the same boat as others around you. The correspondents who stay quiet and go with the flow are most likely to reach the top. Those who manage good relationships.
As Shinzo Abe's approval ratings hang in the balance, lingering doubts about Abenomics and Japan's international involvement, as well as unease about a nuclear restart, make the presentation of policies of critical importance. Secrecy in government, a close relationship between power and the press, and self-regulation in the media will be instrumental to Shinzo Abe's plans.
As we just saw, there are some voices in Japan chipping away at the dominance of the corporate and state-run mainstream news media. Takashi Uesugi, who we interviewed for that piece, is a longtime critic of the Kisha Club system. He runs the Japanese-language online magazine No Border, which broke the story about government letters to broadcasters ahead of last year's elections. One of No Border's latest investigations has been into the astronomical expenses being claimed by some members of the Japanese parliament. Corporate corruption is the focus of Facta, which is the print and online magazine that broke the news of large-scale fraud at the Japanese technology giant Olympus. That was the story that Nikkei, Japan's leading financial and business news outlet, initially refused to touch. And it's no coincidence that Facta's founder, Shigeo Abe, is a former Nikkei journalist who left that outfit when editors spiked another story about corporate fraud back in the 1990s. One resource in English is the Shingetsu News Agency, which is run by an American academic, Michael Penn. It carries original articles on culture, society, and politics, especially on controversial issues that the Japanese media are often unwilling to communicate to foreign audiences, such as LGBT rights, opposition to the U.S. military base in Okinawa, and self-censorship in the news media. Check out our Facebook page for more details on all these sites. Finally, you've just made the plane, crammed your carry-on into the overhead bin, taken your seat, and you're ready to zone out. How many of you actually watch the in-flight safety video? Delta Airways has come up with a way to mark the 10th anniversary of YouTube and to get some seasoned air travelers to tune into that safety video by using characters from online memes to capture that captive audience. Delta calls this the internetist safety video on the internet. And it features cameos from some of the web's most popular viral stars. So buckle up, see if you can spot the keyboard cat, the screaming goat, and the grown-up versions of Charlie Bit My Finger. So far, this video has 5 million hits, not counting passengers. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Welcome aboard, and thanks for flying with Delta. Be sure all carry-on items are securely stowed in an overhead bin. Federal regulations require all passengers to comply with the posted placards and lighted information signs located throughout the cabin, in addition to any crew member instructions. Smoking, including the use of e-cigarettes, is not allowed on any Delta flight. Please take a moment to find the exits closest to you. And remember, they might be behind you. It's unlikely, but if cabin pressure changes, the panels above your seat will open, revealing oxygen masks. Be sure to adjust your own mask before helping others.
Ah! Charlie bit my finger again!
Please relax and enjoy your flight.